Hi all. I am so glad you are here for another chapter in our journey through US history. Whether you are a first time listener or a regular traveler through time with us, a warm welcome to Irregular Mind. If you are just joining us, I highly encourage you to go back and listen to our earlier episodes. We have covered fascinating topics from the earliest civilizations to the rise of 13 colonies. In our last episode, we explored the foundation of colonial America, diving deep into Virginia's evolution, the formation of regional identities, and the seeds of unity that would one day grow into a nation. It's a story filled with triumphs, challenges, and the first whispers of rebellion. Now, before we get started, I have a small favor to ask. If you are enjoying this podcast, please take a moment to rate, follow, and share Irregular Mind with your friends and family or anyone who loves history. Your support helps this podcast grow and reach more curious minds just like yours. And as always, I would love to hear your thoughts. Feedbacks and ideas are always welcome. Let's dive into today's episode, where we will unpack the rising tensions that would set the stage for monumental change in colonial America. Let's go. We will take a small detour to England. The year is 1689. The English Bill of Rights is passed. It was born out of the turmoil of the Glorious Revolution. This revolution saw the overthrow of King James II, who had alarmed the nation with his authoritarian rule and overt Catholic favoritism, leading to the fears of a return to absolute monarchy. His replacement by William III and Mary II came with conditions. They had to agree to limits on royal power and recognize the authority of Parliament. The Bill of Rights established principles of limited government and individual liberties in Britain. It curtailed the powers of the monarchy, ensuring that the king or queen could not levy taxes, maintain a standing army, or suspend laws without Parliament's consent. Key provisions included rights to free elections, the prohibition of cruel and unusual punishments, and the freedom of speech within Parliament. In England, this marked the formal establishment of constitutional monarchy, permanently shifting the balance of power from crown to parliament and strengthening the role of the people's representatives. For the American colonies, the Bill of Rights served as powerful example of how governance could protect individual freedoms and limit centralized authority. Colonists viewed these rights as guarantees for themselves as British subjects, and over time, they began to question why these liberties were not fully extended to them. This document profoundly influenced colonial demands for self governance and fueled grievances that would later ignite the American Revolution. The 1700s in colonial America were a time of profound change shaped by two transformative movements, the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment. These movements redefined how colonists thought about religion, society, and government, sowing the seeds of revolutionary ideals that would later culminate in the founding of the United States. Sweeping through the colonies in 1730s and 1740s, the Great Awakening was a religious revival movement led by fiery preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Edwards' famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, painted vivid images of salvation and damnation, urging individuals to reconnect with their faith. Whitefield's outdoor sermons attracted massive crowds, emphasizing emotional, personal connection to God over rigid church hierarchies. This movement challenged the established religious institutions, promoting ideas of spiritual equality and individualism. Importantly, it encouraged a sense of unity among the colonies as people across different religions experienced shared spiritual awakenings. Running parallel to the Great Awakening, the Enlightenment brought a wave of intellectual change. Rooted in European philosophy, thinkers like John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, and Isaac Newton inspired colonists to embrace the reason, science, and the concept of natural rights. Locke's idea of life, liberty, and property profoundly influenced colonial leaders, while Montesquieu's call for the separations of power laid the groundwork for future democratic systems. The Enlightenment encouraged critical thinking and a questioning of authority, fostering a belief in self governance and individual freedoms. Together, these movements complemented each other in shaping colonial society. While the Great Awakening appealed to emotions and moral values, the Enlightenment spoke to the reasoning and logic. This combination created a uniquely American perspective that valued both spiritual equality and political liberty, setting the stage for the revolutionary ideals that would soon sweep the colonies. In 1735, John Peter Zenger, a printer of New York Weekly Journal, found himself at the center of a historical legal battle. The weekly journal had been publishing articles criticizing the royal governor of New York, William Cosby, for corruption and abuse of power. Enraged by these allegations, Cosby ordered Zenger's arrest on charge of libel, a serious offense at the time, which equated criticism of government officials with defamation regardless of whether the statements were true or not. The trial was a sensational event, drawing widespread attention to the issue of press freedom. Zenger's lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, mounted a bold defense. Hamilton argued that the truth should be a defense against libel, a revolutionary idea in a legal system where publishing any criticism of the government could lead to punishment. Hamilton's impassioned arguments appealed to the jury's sense of justice and growing belief in accountability for public officials. The jury's decision to acquit Zenger marked a turning point for the concept of freedom of press. This case set a precedent that truth could be used as defense against libel charges, a principle that would later be enshrined in the First Amendment of US Constitution. Beyond the courtroom, the Zenger trial reflected the colonists' increasing frustration with arbitrary authority and their desire for greater accountability in government. It underscored the importance of free press in challenging powers and safeguarding individual rights. This planted seeds of revolutionary ideals that would sweep through the colonies in another couple of decades. By the mid 1700s, the American colonies were expanding rapidly. Settlers pushed westward, eager to claim land in the fertile Ohio River Valley. However, this expansion wasn't happening in a vacuum. The land was already home to various indigenous nations, including the Shawnee, Delaware, and Seneca, who had lived there for generations. These tribes had their own system of governance and trade, often aligned with European powers like French or the British, depending on who offered better terms. The British and French, both claiming the vast territories in the North America, began clashing over control of these frontier lands. The French had established a network of forts and trading posts stretching from Canada down to Louisiana, seeking to secure the fur trade and protect their claims. Meanwhile, British colonists, backed by their growing numbers and economic ambitions, saw the westward expansion as their birthright. This led to increasing friction along the frontier. Small skirmishes between settlers, indigenous tribes, and the French forces became more frequent, setting the stage for larger conflicts. The Ohio River Valley, in particular, became the hotbed of tension, where the boundaries were blurred and the allegiances were tested. These early disputes signaled that the colonies were no longer just extensions of European powers, they were developing their own ambitions and conflicts, and these conflicts were bringing the New World closer to the brink of war. The fur trade was a key driver for conflicts between British and the French. French traders had long established relationships with indigenous tribes, supplying goods like firearms, cloth, and metal tools in exchange for valuable beaver pelts. The British, seeking to tap into this lucrative trade, began encroaching on French controlled territories, creating competition and animosity. At the same time, control of key ports along the waterways like St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes became critical for both empires. The French, with their network of forts, held strategic advantages in these regions, while the British relied on their growing naval power and colonial settlements to challenge French dominance. This competition led to localized skirmishes and raids, often involving alliances with indigenous tribes. Each side sought to gain an edge, turning the frontier into contested battlefields. The escalating tensions were not just economic, they were also cultural. The French and many indigenous tribes had developed mutually beneficial relationships, while the British often viewed the land and its resources as theirs to claim. This differing approach to land and alliances further deepened the divides, drawing more groups into the conflict. As tensions escalated, alliances became a crucial factor in the struggle for dominance in North America. Both the French and British sought to secure the support of indigenous nations whose knowledge of the land and strategic positions could tip the scales in their favor. The French aligned closely with Huron, Algonquin, and other tribes, leveraging long standing trade relationships to build trust and cooperation. These alliances gave French a significant advantage in navigating the interior territories and defending their forts. The British, meanwhile, found allies in the Iroquois Confederacy, a powerful coalition of six indigenous nations. Though Iroquois often played a balancing act between two European powers, their eventual tilt towards the British provided critical support in key battles. These alliances were not without complications. Indigenous nations had their own agendas and were not simply pawns in European conflicts. They sought to protect their lands and resources, often switching sides or negotiating terms based on the shifting circumstances. The involvement of indigenous allies added layers of complexity to the conflicts, turning the struggle for North America into a web of competing interests. In 1754, as tensions boiled over, representatives from several colonies met in Albany, New York, to discuss a unified response to the growing French threat. This meeting resulted in the Albany Plan of Union proposed by Benjamin Franklin. The plan called for the colonies to form a centralized government for mutual defense and the management of relations with indigenous nations. Franklin famously illustrated the urgency of unity with his join or die political cartoon depicting a severed snake representing the fragmented colonies. While the Albany Plan was ultimately rejected by both colonies and the British Crown, colonists feared losing autonomy and Britain worried about empowering the colonies. It marked an important step towards the idea of collective action and self governance, themes that would resurface during American Revolution. Enter George Washington. The rising tensions along the frontier brought a young Virginian named George Washington into spotlight. Washington, born in 1732 to a modest planter family, had grown up in the Tidewater region of Virginia. He lost his father at a very young age, but his ambitions and determination set him apart. By his late teens, Washington had trained as a surveyor mapping the western frontier, which gave him first hand knowledge of the contested territories. In 1753, as hostilities between the British and French escalated, Washington was tasked with delivering an ultimatum to the French demanding that they vacate the Ohio River Valley. The French refused, setting the stage for further conflict. In 1754, Washington led a small force to build a fort at the strategically important fork of Ohio River, where the modern day Pittsburgh now stands. However, the French had already constructed Fort Duquesne at the site, forcing Washington to retreat and hastily construct Fort Necessity. The battle at Fort Necessity was Washington's first military engagement and ended in a humiliating defeat. The French, alongside the indigenous allies, overwhelmed the fort and Washington was forced to surrender. Despite his setback, Washington's actions marked the beginning of the broader conflict known as the French and Indian War, and his leadership skills would continue to develop, shaping his future role as a central figure in American history. The defeat at Fort Necessity was only the beginning of French and Indian War, which would become the part of the larger global conflict known as the Seven-Year War, which was between 1756 and 1763. This war pitted Britain and its colonies against France and its allies in a battle for supremacy in North America and beyond. British regulars, known as the Redcoats, were sent to the colonies to support the war effort, marking a significant escalation of British involvement in colonial affairs. Although the early years of the war saw French victories, thanks to their superior knowledge of terrain and strong alliance with indigenous nations, the tide eventually turned in Britain's favor. Key to this shift was the British capture of Fort Duquesne, which they renamed Fort Pitt in honor of Prime Minister William Pitt. This victory secured British control over Ohio River Valley and set the stage for further successes. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. France ceded much of its North American territory to Britain, including Canada and lands east of Mississippi River. This marked the end of French colonial ambitions in North America and solidified Britain's dominance. However, This newfound control came at a cost both in terms of debt and strained relations with indigenous nations and the colonies themselves. Following the French defeat, Britain faced a new challenge maintaining control over its expanded territories. Indigenous resistance, led by Ottawa leader Pontiac, erupted in 1763, known as the Pontiac's War. This conflict saw the coalition of tribes attacking British forts and settlements, pushing back against colonial encroachment on their land. To ease tensions and stabilize the frontier, the British issued the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited colonists from settling west of Appalachian Mountains. While intended to prevent further conflict, the proclamation angered colonists eager to expand into newly acquired territories. This tension added to growing colonial resentment towards British policies, setting the stage for further discord in the years to come. 1760s and 1770s. This period was a tumultuous one in the American history, as whatever happened in the world stage seemed to just act as a catalyst for the Revolutionary War. In this segment, we are diving into the Parliament and protests, a period when policies from across the Atlantic began to test the patience of American colonists. Imagine living in a thriving but fragile colony where decisions that impacted your daily life are made thousands of miles away by people who have never set foot in your land. That's exactly how the American colonists felt as British Parliament began imposing a series of taxes and regulations aimed at consolidating power and recovering debt from 7 Years' War. What started as grumbles over taxes would escalate into fiery debates, secret meetings, and public demonstrations. The colonists, who had long been loyal subjects to British Crown, began to question their rights. Did they deserve representation in Parliament? Could they continue to prosper under the weight of British policies? This is the period when protests over stamps, tea, and soldiers in red coats gave rise to collective resistance. This is the time filled with frustration, determination, and the colonies took their first steps toward a break from the world's most powerful empire. For much of the early colonial period, Britain took a hands off approach to governing its American colonies. This policy, known as the statutory neglect, allowed the colonies to operate with considerable autonomy. As long as they remained loyal to the crown and contributed to the empire's overall prosperity, Britain largely ignored the specifics of how they governed themselves or handled trade. This freedom became the foundation of the colony's success. It fostered self reliance, local governance, and economic growth, planting the seeds for independence the colonies would later demand. But all of that changed after 7 Years' War ended in 1763. Britain had emerged victorious in the war, securing vast new territories in North America. But that victory came at a staggering cost. Britain was drowning in debt, and the Parliament needed new revenue streams to recover. The colonies, with their booming economies, seemed like a logical place to start. Suddenly, the loosely enforced navigation acts were being applied with vigor, restricting colonial trade to benefit British merchants. On top of that, new taxes and regulations began arriving from London. This shocked the colonists who had grown accustomed to their freedom. And it wasn't just about money. There was also the matter of newly acquired territories. With the Treaty of Paris in 1763, Britain gained control over vast lands in North America, but the governing and defending those territories came with a hefty price tag. The British government issued the Proclamation of 1763, barring colonists from settling west of Appalachian Mountains, hoping to avoid further conflicts with indigenous people. To many colonists, this felt like a betrayal. Hadn't they fought in the war to secure those lands? The end of statutory neglect marked a dramatic shift in the relationship between Britain and its colonies. For years, the colonies have been allowed to chart their own course. But now, London was watching and controlling more closely than ever. And how did the colonies respond? At first, with frustration and confusion. But that frustration quickly turned into organized resistance. As the taxes like Sugar Act and Stamp Act were introduced, the colonists began to see these changes not just as financial burdens but as an attack to their rights and freedoms. The end of statutory neglect wasn't just a policy change, it was a turning point. It shattered the illusion of autonomy and set the colonies on path towards confrontation with the crown. In many ways, it was the first step towards the revolution. As we conclude this episode, the colonies are on the brink. The frustrations and injustices we have discussed today are about to ignite into full blown conflict. The winds of change are sweeping across the New England, and soon the cry for independence will echo louder than ever. And speaking of change, in the next episode, we'll dive headfirst into the heat of revolution. We will explore the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the rallying cry of no taxation without representation. We will uncover the anger sparked by Townshend Acts and watch as New England burns in the fervor of rebellion. It's the start of a story that will change the world forever. If you have enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to rate, follow, and share Irregular Mind. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much for tuning in and for being part of this journey through history. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and get ready to feel the heat of revolution as we dive into the next thrilling chapter of America's history. Take care. I'll see you next time on Irregular Mind.